First of all, I just want to say it's a pleasure being here. Yesterday was a great day. And the first part, I'm going to talk about the larger picture of an anatomy of an epidemic. And what I did in that book, which Steve is talking about, is I really asked a question that we need to ask, but isn't often asked. And that is, how do psychiatric medications affect people's lives over the long term? So we know that psychiatric drugs, like all drugs, they get approved because over a very short period of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe they knock down a target symptom of a disorder better than placebo, and that is seen as they're effective. But people, of course, stay on these drugs for years. You're even told they fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and that's why you have to keep on taking the drugs. So I asked this question: how do they affect people over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Which is, of course, the answer we really want answered. We don't just want to know about short-term symptom suppression. We want to know about that longer story. So I'll talk about that and sort of build on what I spoke about yesterday, and maybe for 30 minutes. And then the second part is this new book, Psychiatry Under the Influence, really goes to the theme of this conference, the real truth about health. So you're going to hear a story which you don't hear in the media, and then the question is, why? Why does our society organize itself around one narrative, and then when you go to the science, you find actually a very different narrative found in the scientific literature? So why isn't that narrative the one that the whole population knows and is the organizing principle for our social response? And I spent a year as a fellow at Harvard studying institutional corruption. How do institutions in our society end up betraying their public mission? They asked me to look at the institution of psychiatry, which means the American Psychiatric Association and academic psychiatry. In what way did they, in essence, become a corrupt institution in which they put interests of pharmaceutical companies and their own guild interests above their duty to the public? So that'll be the second half of this talk, and I'm going to wing it, and hopefully it'll be okay, but no slides. So let's just go to the story about anatomy of an epidemic and the narrative that generally drives our thinking about psychiatric medications. The larger narrative in our society goes like this. Prior to 1955, we lacked therapies that would prevent people in psychiatry, that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Then we get a new drug, which you know as Thorazine, arrives in asylum medicine in 1955. And according to the narrative this kicks off a great psychopharmacological revolution, this great advance in care. And now listen to the names that are, when this drug arrives, it's known as a neuroleptic, meaning taking hold of the nervous system, or it's known as a major tranquilizer. But then very shortly, the drug is renamed in psychiatry. And they say this drug is not just a tranquilizer, it's not just taking hold of the nervous system, it is an antipsychotic. So what do you hear in that word? Antipsychotic, like an antibiotic. It's a drug that is a specific antidote to psychosis. And that drives the thinking of people in the field. We now have an antidote to psychosis. And then what do we get? Antidepressants. Same thing, that these are an antidote to something biologically wrong that causes depression. It's a specific drug. And then we get anti-anxiety agents. And all this happens in the 1960s. We now deinstitutionalize. We let people out of the mental hospitals. That is credited to the drugs. It's actually not true, but it is credited to the drugs in this narrative. And then in this narrative of progress, it goes like this. In 1987, Prozac arrives on the market. And this is the first of the second generation of psychiatric drugs, which is said to be so much better, safer, and more effective than the first. Prozac is an antidepressant. It's known as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. This drug is said to be so much better than the old tricyclics and the old monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Then we get new antipsychotics, which are also said to be so much better. And in 1998, U.S. Surgeon General David Satcher, sorry, I just had that moment where the brain wasn't working. Anyway, U.S. Surgeon General David Satcher, he wrote a report on mental health, like a 400-page report, and he said this. He summed up this history of progress. Prior to the arrival of Thorazine in asylum medicine, we lacked treatments that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Now we have a vast array of drugs and therapies for very well-defined diseases, and it helps people live normal lives. That's the story of progress. Now, this is coming from your top doctor in the United States, and it's a story of progress, right? Drugs that are specific antidotes, helps people lead ordinary lives, and it prevents chronicity. Okay? That's the story in writ large. Oh, and by the way, as part of this story of progress, what happens do we learn about in the 80s, early 90s? We hear that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain. So we hear that that depression is due to low serotonin. You take an SSRI at up serotonergic levels, and therefore it's like a treatment like for insulin for diabetes. This is part of this narrative of progress. Now just focus for a moment on that story, that chemical imbalance story. That is telling of an extraordinary medical discovery. That is telling us that we have discovered the cause of schizophrenia. We have discovered the cause of depression. We've even discovered the cause, apparently, of ADHD and all these other disorders. We have identified the molecules that say why this person has a broken brain, and we can fix it. If that's so, there are few things in medical history as profound a leap forward as that. Think about how complicated the brain is, right? Unbelievably complicated. And researchers have identified the molecule that's amiss in these things, and we can fix it. That is extraordinary of a story of extraordinary leap forward. Okay? And that's the narrative, really, that has been told to us as a people. And it's also a narrative that somewhat was told within psychiatry, too. So what I did in this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, to begin to put that narrative under a microscope, was do this. Okay, Prozac arrives in 1987, right? This is the first of the second generation drugs. It's also the time when we as a population really begin to embrace the use of these drugs. So in 1987, we as a people in the United States spent about $800 million on psychiatric drugs. We're now spending about $40 billion a year on psychiatric drugs, 50-fold increase. You know what percentage of Americans of all ages now take a psychiatric drug on a daily basis? Any guess? It's 20%. So 1 in 5. That tells you how prevalent these become. We, of course, have children. I think it's the latest data I saw on children. About 13%. No, excuse me, 13% have been diagnosed. It's about 10% now on a drug every day. That's from 6 to 17. So we're making great use of these drugs. It's really changed our society in many ways. So the first thing I did to look at this story of progress was just look at the number of people on disability in the United States due to mental illness. Now, if the narrative is true, you should see, if anything, when you have a great advance in care, right? You should see the burden of that illness either go down, you shouldn't expect it to go up. You should either maybe stay the same for some reason, but really you should see it go down, right? Especially if the story is that this helps people live normal lives, helps them function. So how about disability rates in the United States? Well, among adults, in 1987, there were 1.25 million adults on disability, meaning they were getting a disability payment from the federal government because they couldn't work. There's two types, there's SSI and SSDI. And they were being declared eligible because they had a mental illness. And what is it today? Anybody know? If you were here yesterday and listening, you know it's 5 million people today. So during this time, since Prozac and these better drugs arrived on the market, rather than seeing the burden of mental illness, at least as measured by these government statistics, go down, we're seeing a rising number of people on disability. By the way, the disability numbers are being driven by affective disorders, depression, and bipolar. That's what's really driving the disability numbers. How about children? Before 1980s, we didn't medicate our children much, right? It's a new thing. We now raise our kids in a different environment. In 1987, there were only 16,200 children in the entire United States whose families or foster care parents were receiving a disability payment due to mental illness. 16,200. Now, of course, since 1987, we've increasingly diagnosed youth with ADHD and bipolar and depression. So how many disabled kids today on disability? It's about 700,000. So during this time of second-generation drugs, we're seeing this rising disability numbers. By the way, if you follow those kids who get on disability as children, when they hit age 18, it seems about 2/3 go on to adult disability right away. So what you see is a new career path that has opened up in our society, where you get diagnosed and said to be mentally ill early on, and that becomes sort of your lot in life. Now, after I published this book, people said, you know, the reason you have such a disability problem in the United States is because you don't have access to health insurance. It's sort of a Darwinian society, and people are going on disability because they can't get welfare or they can't get health insurance. So that's how it was explained away. So since then, however, I've had the chance to look at disability numbers in countries that have very good access to health care and have very good social nets. Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Germany, etc. New Zealand, Australia, every single country I've looked at that has adopted this paradigm of care has had a remarkable increase in disability due to mental illness. In Australia, it's about 4 times as high as it was 20 years ago. New Zealand, about 4 times as high. So what you see is this disability burden is happening in every society, at least Western society that I've looked at, that has really adopted this paradigm of care. Now, those disability numbers, I don't think, prove anything about the long-term merits of drugs. They just raise a question. Why, as we use these medications more and more, are we seeing more disability? So the next thing I did in this book, and as those of you who were here yesterday, the next step in this book was looking at this chemical imbalance story. Is it true? Have we found that depression is due to low serotonin? Have we found that schizophrenia or psychotic disorders are due to too much dopamine in the brain? There was some thought that ADHD was due to too little dopamine, that sort of thing. So I looked, and the first thing you find is that starting in 1980, there was this regular repetition of pronouncements from the American Psychiatric Association that that is so. We have found that depression is due to low serotonin, and these drugs fix that problem, like insulin for diabetes. They bring it back into balance. That's what you were told. And by 2005, the American Psychiatric Association did a survey, and 75% of Americans now know that depression is due to low serotonin. A later survey said 87% of Americans now know that depression is due to low serotonin. And in 2005, you even see a marketing campaign by the APA to say, psychiatrists are doctors who bring your chemistry back into balance. They're specialists in this function. But now you go to the research, and you look at, do people with depression, diagnosed with depression, prior to going on this drug, do they have low serotonin? And this research, and then what you find is this. The whole theory arose because of an understanding of how drugs act on the brain. So let's take it like a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Real quickly, I know this is going over things yesterday, but we'll just go it real quickly. How do neurons communicate in the brain? You have a presynaptic neuron that releases that molecule, like serotonin or dopamine, into a tiny gap between neurons. This is called the presynaptic neuron. It releases that molecule. Then that molecule, like say serotonin, which we call a chemical messenger, binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, which we call the postsynaptic neuron, and we say it fits into those receptors like a key into a lock. You've all heard that, right? As part of this chemical messaging, what does the brain have to do? It has to remove that chemical now from that synaptic cleft, right? So there's going to be a pulse. The chemical is released. It binds with receptors on the second one, the postsynaptic neuron. That causes that neuron to fire. And now it has to have a way to end that message sharply. And so now it removes that serotonin from the synaptic cleft. And it does it in one of two ways. It either goes back up into the presynaptic neuron, or an enzyme comes along, metabolizes it, and the serotonin metabolites are carted off as waste. So what does Prozac and the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors do? They block the removal of serotonin from that synaptic cleft, so it can no longer go back into the presynaptic neurons. It stays in that gap longer than normal, and therefore theoretically ups serotonergic activity. So once people came to understand that mechanism, they said, well, maybe the problem is low serotonin then. You see what they're doing? They're hypothesizing the low serotonin based not on an understanding of what's happening to people, but on the basis of the mechanism of action. This goes back a long way, but in the 1980s, they begin investigating this low serotonin theory of depression, and what do they find? They find that prior to going on drugs, they can't find any serotonergic abnormality. This was first reported by the NIMH in 1983. And then after Prozac comes to market, there's a flurry of more research, and they just never find a lesion in the serotonergic system as a cause of depression. And so even while the public is being told about drugs fixing chemical imbalances, you go, for example, to the 1999 textbook of the American Psychiatric Association, they said, we didn't find it. Okay? And they even say, they sort of make fun of the origins of the hypothesis, because they said, just because a drug has a mechanism of action, there's no reason the pathology is going to be the opposite of that mechanism of action. Anyway, you find it again and again. Kenneth Kendler in 2005, he says, Kenneth Kendler is one of the world experts in chemical imbalances. He's been researching this for a long time. And here's what he says in 2005. We have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for these disorders and have not found them. Okay, so that story is a false story. So you see that the story that led us to embrace these drugs, in fact, is not scientific. It was a hypothesis that was investigated and not found to be true. But there's another kicker to this story. They did find, after you go on the drugs induce the very abnormalities that are hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. Now, why is this? Think about this. Let's go back to these drugs. You have an SSRI. It blocks the reuptake of serotonin in the brain, right? What's that doing to serotonergic activity? It's putting down an accelerator, supposing upping serotonergic activity, right? That's what we all hear. Well, what do you think your brain does in response? The brain, being this extraordinary neuroplastic organ with all these feedback loops, it measures that, and all of a sudden a signal goes out and says, uh-oh, serotonin is staying too long in the synaptic cleft. That's a problem. We're now out of balance because of the drug. And so now what researchers have said, the brain now tries to compensate for this perturbation of normal function. It's trying to adapt, and it's trying to compensate in order to do what? To maintain what they call a homeostatic equilibrium, normal functioning. So if you put a drug in that ups serotonergic activity, what does your brain do? It dials down its serotonergic activity. And it will dial it down in two ways. The presynaptic neurons will put out less serotonin than normal. Now, I'm not quite sure how long that compensatory adaptation lasts. It seems like the research is a little bit confusing on that. But that's one way. In rats, by the way, you end up depleting the forebrain of serotonin if you put them on an SSRI. But more well known is that the receiving neurons, with the receptors for serotonin, they will decrease their number of receptors on their cellular surface for that molecule. They're becoming desensitized to serotonin. And again, you can see why. You have a drug that acts as an accelerator, your brain puts down the brake, okay? And this is the way to understand how the drugs work. And you can read a 1996 paper by Stephen Hyman, who was then director of the NIMH, and he lays this out. He says, here's how psychiatric drugs work. They perturb normal function. Your brain then tries to adapt to it. You get long-lasting neuronal changes, and then he says the brain is now operating in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. So we have an image of the drugs as normalizing drugs. In fact, they're abnormalizing drugs. And just to go back to this, remember depression was hypothesized to be due to a biological deficiency in serotonin in that system. They found that prior to going on the drug, you don't have that deficiency. But after you go on the drug, your presynaptic neuronal release of serotonin is disturbed, abnormal. And physiologically, the postsynaptic neurons now have fewer serotonergic receptors than normal. So you've driven the brain biologically into a subserotonergic state, which was the very state hypothesized to cause depression in the first place. Now, it's really pretty easy to flesh this out in the literature, but you can see, this is a Real Truth About Health conference, nobody going on an antidepressant is told that story, right? Nobody. It's not in your advertisements. Even most of the doctors don't know about it. Once you understand this, however, so now let's go back to this image. You go on an SSRI, it puts down the accelerator. Your brain puts down the brake. Now you take the accelerator away when you're trying to come off the drug. You see why you have a problem? your brain has become adapted to the presence of the drug, and now it's missing that. And this is seen as why you're having so many withdrawal symptoms. So that's one thing. Two, is this going to renormalize in the absence of the drug? Is your brain going to renormalize its receptor densities? The answer is we don't know. There's some worry that it will persist, and even if you come off, it won't renormalize, and then there is some sense that it will. And it seems to me that sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but we really don't know the answer to that question. So you can see once on, going off is tough, but now let's look about the long-term functioning of your serotonergic system. You've got a drug doing one thing, your brain trying to compensate for that. You think that's going to lead to ideal functioning of that system? It doesn't, basically, you see. And this is why you see so many side effects. That ability to compensate for the perturbation is not perfect. So that's a conception of drugs. Once you have this conception that you can now take as you look to see how the drugs affect people over the long term. Okay? And I think you can see two things, why coming off is so difficult and why maybe you're going to have problems over the long term as you sort of impair the functioning of this pathway.